This is Sunday Morning Newsmakers with Larry Marino. A discussion beyond the headlines with and about newsmakers who impact our lives on AM 870. The Answer.
Coming up on Sunday Morning Newsmakers, there's a new study out by a private research firm getting a lot of attention from the education and policymaking community. We'll talk about it with Kristen Olson, Assembly Republican Leader, Assembly District 12. Then, the Newport Beach City Council this week voted 5-2 to accept an interim plan that will place at least 15 wood-burning fire rings on Corona Del Mar State Beach and in an area near the Balboa Pier. We'll talk with Assemblyman Travis Allen, 72nd District, about that. Then meet Till Cars. He's known as the Speak Doctor and has been a business communications consultant for 25 years. See what there is to learn about better communication skills. But first,
many of these Islamists are middle class, lower middle class people. I'm very skeptical of the explanation that abject poverty or social grievances are motivating this type of behavior. And I think right now, integration is where there's a major failure.
Benjamin Weinthal is joining us. He is an internationally recognized journalist who serves as the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's eyes and ears on the ground in Central Europe. In fact, he is based in Berlin, and he's going to talk with us a bit about the events in France and how things are playing out over in Europe, giving us a perspective on that. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Larry.
And you're joining us via Skype. What is the mood there? What is the reaction, for example, in Berlin to events that have happened in the past couple weeks over in France?
Well, the terrorism attacks in Paris sent a real jolt through German society. But the response has been, particularly from the media, has been very encouraging. The newspapers here have showed great solidarity with Charlie Hebdo. They've published their cartoons on the front pages. As a rule of thumb, there hasn't been much reticence or concern about publishing cartoons that lampoon the Prophet Muhammad or Islam. And what's troubling, though, is there was an attack several days ago on a paper in Hamburg called the Morgen Post, or MoPo for its acronym. And there was a firebomb attack. No one was injured, thankfully. That paper had published Charlie Hebdo cartoons lampooning Islam, and it's unclear who caused the fire. They haven't been able to apprehend a perpetrator or perpetrators yet.
From this side of the world, we're hearing that Al-Qaeda is at least claiming some responsibility in the planning behind this, which, of course, there's been response in this country. Last Sunday, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee believed that President Obama was at least partially responsible for last week's terror attack, in that by getting out of entirely Iraq, it allowed the movement to grow more over there. And, of course, we're talking about Senator John McCain. Talk with us a bit about Europe and the Middle East and where the extreme Muslim movement is growing right now, because we hear numbers that there are too many to watch, is the way one commentator described it.
I think that's correct. There is a problem of radical Islamists in Europe. Germany, for example, has there have been 500 German Muslims who have traveled to Syria. 150 have returned. The numbers are probably higher in terms of combatants traveling to Syria, because they generally go straight to Turkey, which does not require a visa, and radicals work their way from Istanbul to southern Turkey on the border and enter into Syria. I've been to the Syrian-Turkey border in 2013, and I actually observed radicals crossing over a very porous border. Germany held its first trial recently of a combatant who returned, and the security service here, the Domestic Intelligence Agency, and also in France, these services, from my perspective, are enormously taxed right now. The French intelligence agency is one of the best in the world. It's a first-rate counterintelligence and counterterrorism apparatus, but the numbers have ballooned up, the numbers of radical French Islamists, that they're overworked and under-resourced. And the problem, from my perspective, is mainly one of political will. And that's where it's been difficult. And there seems to be a wake-up call right now in France, where you've seen Prime Minister Valls declare a war on radical Islam, on terrorism, on jihadism. That type of rhetoric is quite extraordinary. Most politicians here, similar to the United States, tend to use euphemisms or avoid language like we're declaring a war on radical Islam.
Benjamin, we want to ask you a bit about the sheer numbers because in the French story there was reports that, oh yeah, we had been monitoring these people and a couple of them had made 500 phone calls back and forth, but we stopped monitoring them. There's so many to watch. I mean, does this not portend for dangerous times ahead? Too many to watch.
It does, and that's why the situation is very frightening. The Karachi brothers went off the radar screen at one point, it appears, for the intelligence agencies, and they're monitoring a lot of radical Islamists. It's very difficult because of protections of civil liberties to simply arrest radical Islamists who haven't moved forward with an actual plan or have covered their electronic footprint very well by not using email or mobile phones, and rather they're sitting in an apartment or outside planning these types of acts and insulating themselves from any type of surveillance. So that's the challenge ahead. In Germany, for example, you may remember in 2011, a German Muslim, Arid Uka, shot and killed 2 American servicemen at the Frankfurt airport. The problem was very similar. This attack garnered very little press in Europe, but in the United States it attracted attention, of course. But he wasn't being monitored by the German intelligence agencies. And in fact, a police official told me the German intelligence service simply doesn't have enough Arabic speakers to monitor his website, for example, which showed jihadi rhetoric. And there could have been a better effort to stop him. The best way to stop some of these Islamists, but it really hasn't been used as much as it has been in the US, is sort of the entrapment approach, where you set up agents to meet with jihadis and talk about supplying them with guns. It's a very sensitive topic and very tricky, but that might be one way of trying to combat this in the future.
So how does it get going? What causes the radicalized Islam individual? Is there a profile on this? Is this someone who's disadvantaged or feels economically left out, who maybe watches the excesses in America and fights back against it? Give us a definition of what we know that draws individuals in to interpret killing if you besmirch the leader, that kind of thing.
Well, there's various attractions across Europe. Many of the Islamists, for example, in France recently and also in Germany, seem to bounce from job to job. They're what one might call losers. They were born in France or Germany, grew up living sort of a secular, normal teenager life, and then something changed where they sought meaning in their life and became attracted to a form of radical Sunni Islam. And if you look at the socioeconomic backgrounds of many of the Islamists in Germany and France, in Austria, Belgium, many of these Islamists are middle class, lower middle class people. I'm very skeptical of the explanation that abject poverty or social grievances are motivating this type of behavior. And I think Europe right now, many European leaders have internalized this point that social grievances are not the problem, although integration is where there's a major failure. And I think Chancellor Merkel, for example, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, has stressed that multiculturalism has failed, she said a number of years ago, and we have to find a way to better integrate Muslims.
As we talk about this, I mentioned at the beginning Senator McCain's theory that we should never have left Iraq because it leaves a place for this to foment and grow. What about that?
Senator McCain makes a very compelling case. The absence of Western leadership in Iraq and particularly in Syria, as we're entering the 4th year of a civil war, has created a vacuum. And during the nascent phase of the Syrian war, there was great concern that the Saudis, the Qatar, and other Islamic nations were going to pump money into funding radical Islamists. And that's what happened. At the same time, of course, Bashar Assad the Syrian dictator was allowing a lot of these Islamists to run free while he slaughtered the moderate opposition. So the disengagement factor, I believe, has helped contribute to this overall jihadi problem in Europe and in the Middle East. And I'm of the view more intervention from the West would have helped. Obama's decision, for example, in 2013 to not use missiles to strike Assad after he used chemical weapons on his own population was also a mistake, in my view, because it sent a message of American impotence in the Middle East. I was in the Middle East at that time, and having conversations with many folks, they realized that actors in the Middle East will not take the Obama administration seriously after you announce military action and then you quickly withdraw it.
A final thought, next steps. And obviously, the story unfolds. We hear about 50 arrests in France. They seem to be stepping it up, trying to make up ground here. A mistake? They weren't trying hard enough? They wanted to be too politically correct? Give us a sense from being over there in Europe if that's correct.
There's been a hyper level of political and social correctness in France, and it is very troubling. In 2006, the former French president Jacques Chirac, a conservative leading president, criticized the French satirical magazine because they published the Danish cartoons lampooning the prophet, and he called that a manifest provocation. And I think that type of saggy appeasement does not help the situation because the Islamists and the radicals seize that and believe they can gain more ground because European leaders are receding. And you see the depth of the problem when France announced on Monday they're going to deploy 10,000 troops to protect Jewish institutions and other sensitive organizations. It's unprecedented. So the future looks very troubling unless Europe can engage in a wholesale revision of its policies toward many of these radical groups. And I would add, Hezbollah, the Lebanese terrorist organization, is still a legal group in Europe. Its political wing operates. It's an organization that murdered French soldiers and American soldiers in Lebanon through a series of suicide bombings in the 1980s. And Europe has tolerated Hezbollah as a legal organization that recruits people on European soil. So the problem is much larger than just France right now.
I want to thank you very much for taking time all the way, joining us from Berlin via Skype. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us.
Thanks for having me.
Benjamin Weinthal, an international journalist, joining us from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Coming up, there's a new study out by a private research firm getting a lot of attention from the education and policymaking community. We'll talk about it with Kristen Olson, Republican leader, Assembly District 12.
Sunday Morning Newsmakers with Larry Marino.